Welcome, welcome, welcome. I am so glad you're here tonight. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight, we'll be reading Black Bourgeoisie by E. Franklin Frazier, some of his thoughts and opinions. And as Anthony McPhail said, that this is a great book and insight into a confused Negro mentality. Hopefully, we'll get some insights and have some conversations.
Greetings. My name is the Revolutionary Matron, and my show is called The Learning Curve. I broadcast on a network called KWAZ Radio. There are other hosts on the network I'd like you to meet.
Greetings, everyone. This is Koku from the Bitter Medicine Podcast, inviting you to tune in to the Bitter Medicine Podcast on KWAZ Radio.
Peace, family. This is Oni, inviting you to listen to the Pro-Black Perspective, where Black problems are addressed with Black solutions.
This is D Webb with the Harsh Reality Podcast, asking you to tune in where we tackle the news of the day that affects our community, only on KWAZ Radio.
The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed here belong solely to the respondents, and they do not necessarily reflect any broadcast networks, affiliates, nor sponsors. The Learning Curve is a broadcast created for the benefit of my global community. Black is a consciousness. Content is being used for our commentary, research, criticism, education, scholarship, teaching, preaching, and news reporting. No copyright infringement is intended. I will make enunciation mistakes. I will give you my opinion about the information. And if you ever ask, I will send you my source.
E. Franklin Frazier on the Negro Press. The Negro Press is not only one of the most successful business enterprises owned and controlled by Negroes, it is the chief medium of communication which creates and perpetuates the world of make-believe for the Black bourgeoisie. Although the Negro Press declares itself to be the spokesman for the Negro group as a whole, it represents essentially the interests and outlook of the Black bourgeoisie. Its demand for equality for the Negro in American life is concerned primarily with opportunities which benefit the Black bourgeoisie economically and enhance the social status of the Negro. The Negro Press reveals the inferiority complex of the Black bourgeoisie and provides a documentation of the attempts of this class to seek compensations for its hurt self-esteem and exclusion from American life. Its exaggerations concerning the economic well-being and cultural achievements of Negroes, its emphasis upon Negro society, all tend to create a world of make-believe into which the Black bourgeoisie can escape from its inferiority and inconsequence in American society. So those were his thoughts and opinions about the Negro Press. This book has a preface. This book first appeared in France as one of the studies in the collection known as Recherches en Sciences Humaines. When the French edition was published, I expected that, like so many social science studies, it would become lost on the shelves of university libraries. It came as a pleasant surprise, therefore, to learn that it attracted sufficient attention in the academic world to be made the basis of the McIver Lectureship Award by the American Sociological Society in 1956. When the English edition was published in the United States in 1957, I was even more surprised by the controversy it aroused among Negroes and the unfavorable reaction of many whites. The reaction of the Negro community is understandable when one realizes the extent to which the book created the shock of self revelation. In fact, if one should undertake to conceptualize the reaction of the Negro community, the initial reaction, at least on the part of its more articulate leaders, was one of shock. It appeared that middle class Negroes were able to see themselves for the first time, and, as they feared, in the way that they appeared to outsiders. They did not challenge the truth of the picture which had been presented so much as they were shocked that a Negro would dare place on display their behavior and innermost thoughts. Their naive attitude towards their behavior and outlook on life was strikingly revealed in the remark of a journalist whose publication had been drawn on for much illustrative material for the book. When I met his criticism of quoting materials by asking him if his publication was not a reliable source of information, he replied that the facts in the book looked and sounded different from what they did where they appeared in his magazine. The magazine is called Bourgeoisie Noire in Paris Library in 1955. Following the initial shock of revelation was intense anger on the part of many leaders in the Negro community. This anger was based largely upon their feeling that I had betrayed Negroes by revealing their life to the white world. I was attacked by some Negroes as being bitter because I had not been accepted socially, and by others as having been paid to defame the Negro. In one Negro newspaper, there was a sly suggestion that Negroes should use violence to punish me for being a traitor to the Negro race. Some of the anger was undoubtedly due to the fact that I had revealed the real economic position of the Negro. They were particularly incensed by a mere statement of fact that the total assets of all Negro banks in the United States were less than those of a small single white bank in a small town in the state of New York. The anger of the middle class over this statement showed how much they regarded the book as a threat to their economic interests. They had helped to create the myth of the vast purchasing power of Negroes, which had become the justification for large corporations to employ Negro salesmen so as to exploit the Negro market. So this purchasing power illusion has always been an illusion for almost 100 years. It is interesting to note, however, that the anger on the part of the Negro community was not shared by all strata. From rumors and from what appeared to be in book reviews by both white and Negro newspapers, some working class Negroes got the impression that I had written a book attacking upper class, light-skinned Negroes. As a consequence, I was even stopped on the street by working class Negroes who shook my hand for having performed this long overdue service. As the book became more widely read and discussed, Negroes began to judge the book more soberly, and in many cases, not only to applaud my courage in writing the book, but to say that it was an important contribution to an understanding of the Negro's plight in the United States. Numerous letters were sent directly to me and sometimes to the Negro newspapers defending the book or congratulating me on my courage. One minister wrote that the book should be read by every Negro preacher in the United States. Letters of this type continue to come to me, and I am constantly invited to speak to forums and groups on the position and outlook of the new Negro middle class. This reaction of the Negro community presented a sharp contrast to what happened when the reaction of Negroes was characterized by anger. For example, I was invited to a Negro sorority to discuss the book, but so much bitterness was aroused by the invitation that it had to be canceled. One leading member of the sorority accused me of having set the Negro race back 50 years. But such reactions are rare today, and I am much more likely to receive copies of articles or speeches in which there are favorable references to the book, discussions of the book's implications, or even documentation in support of its analysis. The reaction of the white people outside the United States was different, on the whole, from that of white Americans. European and Latin American scholars praise the book, on the whole, as a contribution to social science and as a lucid analysis of what is happening to the American Negro. A great liberal European scholar living in South Africa said that when she read the book, her first reaction was, "My God, the American Negro has finally come of age. He is capable of self-analysis and self-criticism." But she living in South Africa under apartheid. Okay. Under the title Un livre explosif, a leading French newspaper, Le Monde, of February 13th, 1957, carried a perceptive summary view of the book. In fact, it was often European scholars who were most puzzled by the reactions of white Americans. A European told me 2 years ago that he could understand why middle class Negroes might be angry about the book, but that he could not understand the anger which it aroused among some white Americans. Let us turn to the reactions of some white Americans and undertake to explain them. The critical reviews which appeared in American scholarly journals were concerned for the most part with questions involving methodology and the validity of my conclusions. In some of the more serious journals of opinion, there also appeared critical reviews. But even in some of the scholarly reviews, as well as in the serious journals of opinion, there was either an implicit or explicit criticism that the book exhibited anger or lack of sympathy in its stark objectivity. A leading political analyst said that the book was cruel because if Negroes were happy in their world of make-believe, why should I feel it was my duty to let them know the truth about their real position in the United States? Although it appeared that many whites shared this opinion, there were others who welcomed the book as an explanation of the behavior of the middle class Negroes, behavior which had long puzzled them. Some of them came to me and stated frankly that they had been puzzled, for example, by the conspicuous consumption on the part of the middle class Negroes, but after reading the book, they could understand it. Perhaps the main reason for the bitter reaction on the part of some white Americans, some bookstores refused to carry the book because it was controversial, was that it destroyed or tended to destroy the image of Negroes which they wanted to present to the world at this time. The picture which white Americans wanted to present to the world was that although Negroes had been enslaved and had suffered many disabilities since emancipation, on the whole, they were well off economically, had gained civil rights, and had improved their social status. Therefore, what had happened to them during slavery which was, after all, a mild paternalistic system, should be forgotten along with other injustices which they have suffered since. Moreover, their economic position was superior to that of other peoples of the world, especially the colored peoples. One article, published by a distinguished statesman, even went so far as to state that Negroes were spending annually an amount equal to the annual national income of Canada. But that goes back to the spending power myth. Now, Black bourgeoisie was a refutation of this image. It showed that slavery was a cruel and barbaric system that annihilated the Negro as a person, a fact which has been well documented and substantiated in a recent book. That book was called Slavery, A Problem in American Institutional and Intellectual Life, published by the University of Chicago Press in 1959 by Stanley M. Elkins. Moreover, the book also showed how since emancipation, Negroes had been outsiders in American society. Finally, it demonstrated on the basis of factual knowledge that Negroes were not only at the bottom of the economic ladder, but that all the pretended economic gains which Negroes were supposed to have made had not changed fundamentally their relative economic position in American life. It also revealed that the new Negro middle class was comprised almost entirely of wage earners and salaried professionals, and that so-called Negro business enterprises amounted to practically nothing in the American economy. The significance of that statement is that if you are a wage earner or you have a job and you're not making jobs, you're not really making a lot of money because somebody is cutting you a check. You want to be in a position where you're cutting the check. This was not, of course, the image of Negroes that white Americans wanted to present to the world, especially at a time when they were endeavoring to win the confidence and friendship of the colored world. Very often, the question is asked whether there is need for a revision of this book. Has not the economic position of the Negro middle class changed? Have not middle class Negroes become accustomed to their new prosperity and given up much of their conspicuous consumption? To this day, the answer is no. From the latest figures on the occupations and the incomes of middle-class Negroes, there is no reason to revise what was written about the relative size of the middle class and their occupational status, nor the source and amount of their incomes. The essential fact is that they still do not own any of the real wealth in America or play an important role in American business. And it is difficult to see how their economic position could change fundamentally within 5 years. In reply to the second question, one would only need to read Negro newspapers and magazines to see to what extent conspicuous consumption is still the dominant pattern of this class. In the cities of the country, middle-class Negro communities are expanding, but they are characterized by the same conspicuous consumption the book describes. School teachers and college professors who earn less than $10,000 a year are building homes that cost $40,000 and $50,000 and entertaining lavishly. In this connection, one is reminded of the article which appeared recently in a white publication on the Negro aristocracy and Negro millionaires. The article was called Our Negro Aristocracy in the Saturday Evening Post of January 13th, 1962 by Bill Davidson. It should be noted that many Negroes resented this article as a misrepresentation of the real economic position of the Negro professional men and women. Since this article appeared, I have received numerous letters and comments saying the article confirmed what I had said about the world of make believe in which the middle class Negroes live. There is, however, an important aspect of the development of the new Negro middle class that might have been included in this book and certainly could not be omitted from a more detailed study. It is strange that the omission was overlooked by American critics but suggested in a foreign review. I am referring to the most recent accessions to the Negro middle class, who are prominent in the sit-ins and in the other protest movements against racial segregation. They do not have the same social background as the Black bourgeoisie in my study, who represent a fusion of the peasant and the gentleman. Although they have been influenced to some extent by the genteel tradition, on the whole, their social background is essentially that of Negro folk. Very seldom can they or their parents claim ancestors among the mixed blood aristocracy, which was free before the Civil War. So they're saying that a different type of middle class person acceded or went into the Black middle class during this time, during the time of the riots and the sit-ins. Some attention must be given to two more serious criticisms of the book as it now stands. The first concerns the materials upon which the analysis are based. Here, I am not concerned with the question of adequate samplings of middle class Negroes with respect to attributes that can be treated statistically. I am referring especially to the analysis of the patterns of behaviors and values of this class. Let me begin by stating that it would be difficult to secure a more reliable validation of this study in regard to patterns of behavior and style of life and values of the Negro middle class than that which has been provided in the letters and comments which have come to me from cities all over the country. These letters have stated first that they did not know that I had carried on researches in their community until they had read the book, which provided such an authentic picture of the middle class in their city. In many cases, they complained that the picture was so true to life that they could recognize the people by their behavior and verbal statements and their relation to the rest of the community. As a matter of fact, in most cases, I had never made a study in their community. An amusing incident connected with this aspect of the study happened in one city where my junior colleagues had made a housing survey. After the English edition appeared, they were accused of having spied on the behavior of the middle classes and were threatened with a thrashing if they ever returned to that city. The majority of the materials upon which this study was based were materials on thousands of Negro families and many Negro communities, which I had collected during studies over the years. For the purposes of this study, additional materials were collected from newspapers and magazines and from students from middle class families. In many cases, as a participant observer, I collected case materials in the same manner as an anthropologist gathers materials for studies. Another criticism, which deserves attention, was that this study did not reveal anything peculiar to Negroes. This was a criticism offered not only by Negroes who are sensitive about being different from other people, but by white people as well. Some of them were so called liberal whites who, when any statement is made which might be considered derogatory concerning Negroes, are quick to say that the same thing is found among whites. Other whites pointed out what is undoubtedly true, that this book dealt with behavior which is characteristic of middle class people, white, brown, or black. Some of my Jewish friends, including some young sociologists, went so far as to say that the book was the best account that they had ever read concerning middle class Jews. Here, I might repeat what I stated in the book, that the behavior of middle class Negroes was an American phenomenon, and that in writing, I constantly tempted to make comparisons with middle class whites, but the book was essentially a case study of the new Negro middle class. It was not my intention to make a comparative study. As a case study of middle class Negroes, it does show the peculiar conditions under which a middle class emerged among the Negro minority and the peculiar social and cultural heritage of the Negro middle class, which was responsible for its outlook on life. In retrospect, when I consider the reaction of the Negro community and the criticisms of both Negroes and whites of all intellectual levels, I am reminded of a review of the French edition, which appeared on the front page of a French newspaper published in the United States. The review concluded with the questions: would this book arouse heated discussions in which each protagonist would hold stubbornly to his particular opinion? Would it contribute to modifying the mentality of this elite, which is oblivious of its duties and responsibilities? A partial answer was given to these questions by some of the young leaders of the sit-ins who said they did not aspire to become the middle class Negroes described in Black Bourgeoisie. Finally, in regard to the charge that the presentation was brutal or cruel, I will only quote the words of a Catholic sociological review concerning the book. A sad truth is better than a merry lie, written by E. Franklin Frazier at Howard University, February of 1962. I want to say greetings to the forecast and greetings to Brother Bakari and Anthony McPhail. Thank you all for tuning in. I appreciate you for being here. Introduction. The presence of at least 19 million persons of Negro ancestry among the people of the United States is the outcome of the expansion of Europe, which began in the 15th century and became firmly established during the succeeding 2 centuries. As the result of this expansion, Europeans met and conquered many primitive peoples, laid the basis for European settlements, and established commercial relations with the old civilizations of Asia and Africa. European expansion in the Americas became especially important for the economic development of Europe, since the production of tobacco, sugar, and cotton, which were exchanged for European manufactures, increased world trade and brought untold wealth to Europe. For the production of these raw materials and articles of commerce, Negro slaves were transported to the New World and became the main support of the triangular trade involving the metropolis, Africa, and the colonies. Negro slaves thus became the creators of the wealth that made the flowering of capitalism possible in the 19th century. and never forget that fact. Negro slavery and the plantation. In the southern sections of what became the United States, the plantation system of agriculture developed on the basis of enslaved Negro labor. After the failure of the attempt to utilize the native Indians as a source of forced labor, white indentured servants were introduced into the colonies. But soon, but they were soon supplanted by Negro slaves, who proved a more efficient and a more economical source of labor. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the importation of Negroes gradually increased to meet the growing need for laborers in the production of tobacco, rice, and indigo. But with the invention of the cotton gin, which enabled American producers to supply the increased demands of English manufacturers, the importation of Negro slaves was accelerated. As a result, the agitation against slavery, which had found expression along with the idealism respecting liberty during the American Revolution, died down. When the declining productivity of slave labor on tobacco plantations was followed by a period of unprecedented profits in cotton production. The condition of the Negro slaves on the southern plantations varied considerably. In the lower South, where the large cotton plantation tended to take on the character of a purely industrial organization, the treatment of slaves was extremely brutal since they were regarded as mere work animals. They were treated even more inhumanely by slave traders who supplied the needs of a commercial system of agriculture. As articles of commerce, the Negro slaves were treated in the same manner as the mules which were advertised for sale along with them. On the other hand, where the plantation became a social as well as an economic organization under a semi patriarchal regime, more consideration was shown for the personalities of the slaves. The lives of the masters and slaves became intertwined in a system of social relationships. The relations between whites and blacks thus came to be regulated by a complex system of social rules and etiquette, rituals and etiquette, permitting a maximum degree of intimacy while maintaining the complete subordination of blacks. Think about Jim Crow before Jim Crow, the black codes and different things like that. The traditions governing race relations on the plantation became so firmly rooted in the South that they have persisted until the present day. The impact of Western civilization. Where the plantation acquired the character of a social institution, it provided the means by which the Negro slaves could rapidly take over European culture. The basis for the rapid acculturation of the Negro slaves was created by the manner in which the slaves had been captured in Africa, sold on the slave markets, and integrated into the plantation system. The Negro slaves, who represented many different tribal backgrounds, had been captured in Africa during tribal wars and slave hunting expeditions. They had been herded into the barracoons on the coast to await the arrival of slave ships. Then, during the Middle Passage, they were transported in ships in which they were packed, spoon fashion, to the West Indies, where they were sold on the slave markets. In the West Indies, they underwent a period of being broken into slavery before they were shipped to local plantations or to the plantations on the mainland. In the English colonies on the mainland and later in the United States, they were widely scattered on plantations, which had fewer slaves on the whole than did the plantations in the West Indies. On the plantations in the southern states, the Negro slave sloughed off almost completely his African cultural heritage. The African family system was destroyed, and the slave was separated from his kinsmen and his friends. Moreover, in the United States, there was little chance that he could re-knit the ties of kinship and old associations. If by chance he encountered fellow slaves with whom he could communicate in his native tongue, he was separated from them. From the very beginning, he was forced to learn English in order to obey the commands of his white masters. Whatever memories he might have retained of his native land and native customs became meaningless in the New World. The very fact that the majority of the slaves were young males practically eliminated the possibility of recreating a social organization that could perpetuate and transmit the African cultural heritage. So they totally destroyed us. Period, point blank. While all of the slaves were always under the surveillance of whites, the house servants lived constantly in close association with their masters. Very often, these house servants had associated from childhood with their masters. Consequently, they early acquired the speech of their masters, a fact which set them off from the more isolated field hands who spoke a dialect. Living in close association with whites, the house servants were subjected to a type of discipline which caused them to identify themselves with their masters. This discipline included both moral and religious instruction. The slaves participated in the religious life of their white masters, including family prayers and attendance at white churches where a section was reserved for them. Some recognition had to be given to the individual qualities of the slaves, and it was most often among those house servants that these differences were recognized. For example, there was a division of labor on the plantation in which intelligence and talents of the slaves found expression. Generally, the son of a house servant was apprenticed to some artisan to learn a skilled trade. These skilled mechanics, who constituted a large section of the artisans in the South, formed with the house servants a sort of privileged class in the slave community. The greater the integration of the slaves into the activity and family life of their white masters, the more nearly their behavior and ideals approximated those of whites. On the other hand, the field hands, who had few intimate contacts with the whites, were subject to a more formal type of social control, could give expression to a more spontaneous type of behavior, especially in their religious life and in their musical creations. The field hands were especially attracted by the Methodist and Baptist missionaries in their revival meetings, preached a simple doctrine of salvation through conversion in which a highly emotional experience was of primary importance. So they were using religion to manipulate our emotions even back then. Although the slaves were under the surveillance of the whites in order to prevent conspiracies and revolts, they were able to engage in a form of worship different from that of the whites. Think Negro spirituals versus hymns, and the more disciplined house servants. The spirituals or religious folk songs grew out of these relatively independent religious meetings. The new slaves who were brought to the plantations from Africa had to adjust to a social world quite different from that from which they had come. The close association of the races on the plantation, especially in the same household, resulted in considerable race mixture. The interbreeding of the races had begun in the 17th century, soon after the introduction of Negroes into Virginia, and continued on a large scale as long as slavery existed. Many of the mulattoes were emancipated by their white fathers and formed the basis of the free Negro population that grew up in the South before the Civil War. In 1850, mulattoes or mixed bloods constituted 37% of the free Negro population, but only 8% of the slave population. The free Negroes were not evenly distributed over the South, but were concentrated principally in cities and in those states where the plantation system of agriculture did not flourish. In Maryland and Virginia, where there were 83,942 and 58,042 free Negroes, respectively, in 1860, many of these free Negroes owed their freedom to the fact that they had been permitted to hire their time and work as semi-free laborers. With the money which they were able to accumulate after paying their masters for their time, they bought their freedom. Although the majority of the free Negroes in the South did not live much above subsistence level, many of them bought land and became independent farmers or became successful mechanics and skilled artisans. In Charleston, South Carolina, and in New Orleans, the free Negroes, or free people of color, accumulated considerable wealth as skilled artisans and as owners of plantations, included slaves among their possessions. The free Negroes constituted, in fact, the element in the Negro population that had made the greatest progress in acquiring European culture. The pattern of family life of the well-to-do free Negroes in the plantation South was the same as the patriarchal family pattern of the slave-holding whites. Moreover, their outlook on life and their values were the same as the white models. They occupied the position of an intermediate caste in some parts of the South, especially in New Orleans. As a group, the free Negroes of the South were much better off economically than the free Negroes of the North, who had not been able to compete with European immigrants. You hear that? They were better off in the South than they were in the North because of European immigration. Immigration is not necessarily our friend. At one time, the free Negroes in the South outnumbered the free Negroes in the North, but as the result of the persecutions following the anti-slavery agitation in the North, many of them migrated to the North. Nevertheless, half of the nearly 500,000 free Negroes in the United States at the outbreak of the Civil War were in the South. A nation within a nation. As a result of the Civil War and emancipation, the future status of the Negro in American society became one of the most pressing problems facing the American government. This problem was tied up with the problem of reintegrating the Southern states into the federal union. because they didn't give a damn about slavery. They just wanted to save the Union. Remember that. Lincoln he states here that Lincoln was opposed to slavery. Lincoln was not opposed to slavery. Lincoln didn't care about slavery. Lincoln, although opposed to slavery, had never believed that Negroes and whites could be citizens in the same community. He had cautiously suggested that the educated free mulattoes in Louisiana who had fought on the Union side should be permitted to qualify as citizens in the reconstructed government of Louisiana. The assassination of Lincoln followed too soon for him to make known his general program for the future of the Negro. The successor of Lincoln, Andrew Johnson, who was a representative of the non-slave holding poor whites, had remained loyal to the Union, soon made it clear that he wanted to build a democracy in the South consisting only of white citizens or white men of property. So even the poor whites are against Black people. As the result of this policy, he was opposed by two factions of the Republican Party: the abolitionists among the old radicals who were genuinely interested in creating a democracy in the South based upon political participation of whites and Negroes, and the Republicans who, fearing that a white farming class would nullify the victory of the North, wanted to use Negro voters to support legislation that would give a legal basis to triumphant industrial capitalism. So both sides of the political spectrum wanted to use the Negro for their own political advantage. The program of the Republican Congress for the first Reconstruction of the Southern states gave a promise of democratic revolution in an area that had been ruled by a slave-holding oligarchy. Under the protection of the Union Army, the Black freedmen, along with the non-slave-holding whites, were given the right to vote and hold office. 3 amendments to the federal Constitution were necessary, however, to provide a legal basis for the citizenship of the Negro. The 13th, abolishing slavery; the 14th, making him a citizen; and the 15th, forbidding restrictions upon his rights as a citizen on account of race or his previous status as a slave. Some of the more radical Republicans proposed that the plantations be divided in order to create a class of Black and white small landowners. In fact, the Black freedmen had been promised land by the federal government as a guarantee of their freedom. But since this program appeared to be too revolutionary for the majority of the Republican leaders, the vast majority of ex-slaves remained landless, except for a relatively small number of Negroes who had secured land during the Civil War. And that's still true to this very day. The forecast says poor whites and other groups attacked Black people in the North to just like in the South. Absolutely they did. Absolutely they did. And they continue to do so to this very day. Poor whites are not our friends. We have no friends. If we cannot create camaraderie with one another and kinship with one another, we don't have any friends. LGBTQ plus IA, not our friend. They're trying to supplant us. They get more rights and benefits than we do. Hispanics, not our friend. Asians, not our friend. Mexican, not our friend. None of these people groups are our friends. Republicans, not our friends. Democrats, not our friends. We need to be asking these people, what are we going to get for our vote? But anyway, The Negro has been blamed for the disorders and the graft on the part of politicians and speculators during the Reconstruction period. But unprejudiced historians who place the behavior of the Negro during this period in its proper perspective agree that the Negro was the victim of the conflict of economic interests over which he had no control, and that he exhibited considerable wisdom in attempting to help formulate social policies. The Negro gave his support to the establishment of a system of public education and sought to make land available to the great masses of Black and white farmers. But the question of race was utilized to divide the whites and the Negroes. The redemption of the South in 1876, which was hailed as the restoration of white supremacy, really resulted in the political ascendancy of the Bourbons, or the new middle class and the planters. The state constitutions, which were supposed to be the legal instruments by which the barbarous Blacks maintained their power, but were in fact nothing more than the expression of middle class interests, were retained for decades after the restoration of white supremacy. So, what did it really mean? The restoration of white supremacy did not resolve the class conflict among whites in the South. In fact, the white planters sometimes used Negro voters to defeat the aspirations of the disinherited whites. When agrarian unrest among the poor whites of the South joined forces with the populist movement, which represented the general unrest among American farmers, the question of race was used to defeat the cooperation of poor whites and Negroes. It was then that the demagogues assumed leadership of the poor whites, kind of sort of like what's happening right now with Donald Trump, and provided a solution to the class conflict among whites that offered no challenge to the political power and economic privileges of the industrialists and the planter class. The program, which made the Negro the scapegoat, obtained the following provisions. 1. The Negro was completely disenfranchised by all sorts of legal subterfuges with the threat of force in the background. 2. The funds, which were appropriated on a per capita basis for Negro school children, were diverted to white schools. And 3, a legal system of segregation in all phases of public life was instituted. In order to justify this program, the demagogues, who were supported by the white propertied classes, engaged for 25 years in a campaign to prove that the Negro was subhuman, morally degenerate, and intellectually incapable of being educated. So in order to they took our money, they took away all of the resources that were going into the Black schools and into the Black communities. They took away our rights. They totally disenfranchised us. And then they created a legal system of segregation, which means 2 libraries, one for Blacks and one for whites, 2 water fountains, 2 bathrooms. No, you can't go into these restaurants. Oh, you have to go to a different car, even though you paid first class fare. They did all of these different things in an attempt to prove that we were intellectually incapable of being educated. How could we be if they don't fund our schools? That we were subhuman. Well, if you don't treat me like a human being, why do you expect me to act like a human being? And that we were morally degenerate. Well, you don't know what I am and am not, because we're not even doing business in the same places and in the same ways. If you make it so that I can only do business with you as an animal, what do you expect? But anyway, The North acquiesced in this program as a solution of the race problem. The rise to prominence of Booker T. Washington as the leader of the Negroes from 1895 onward was due to his apparent acceptance of racial segregation as a solution of the Negro problem. Under his leadership, support of so-called industrial education for the Negro was provided by Northern capitalists. During the quarter of a century from 1890 to 1915, when lynchings and mob violence were used to put the Negro in his place in the South, Negroes gave up their hope for freedom and equality in American life. Only a small group of Negro intellectuals, led by W.E.B. Du Bois and a few Northern white radicals, on racial issues anyway, attacked the so-called solution of the race problem. But more important than the attack of the radicals were the changes in race relations which were set in motion by the northward migration of the Negro masses that began in 1915 as a result of the First World War. But before analyzing the changes which occurred in race relations as a result of northern migrations, let us consider the nature of the social world of the Negro, which emerged as a result of the system of racial segregation. Until the First World War, only about a tenth of the Negroes in the United States were in the North, and 7/8 of those in the North lived in cities. The residents of the relatively small Negro communities in the northern cities gained their livelihood in domestic and personal service. So those were the jobs that they had. Although they were restricted in their opportunities for employment in industry and white-collar occupations, they did not suffer much discrimination in utilizing public institutions. However, they had their own churches, and their social life revolved chiefly about their own clubs and other organizations. In the South, on the other hand, the entire life of the Negro, except for his contacts with whites as a domestic or personal servant or as a laborer, was restricted to the Negro community. Although this rigid system of racial segregation grew up in a region where, until 1920, more than 3/4 of the Negroes lived on farms and plantations, and the color line in southern cities was as rigid as in rural areas, the majority of the Negroes worked as sharecroppers under a system closely resembling serfdom, while the majority of those in the cities gained a livelihood as domestic servants and as unskilled laborers. The church was the chief center of the Negro's social life in both the cities and in rural areas. It provided the chief means for self-expression and leadership and erected a shelter against a hostile white world. In conjunction with the church, there were the numerous mutual aid societies and fraternal organizations that offered not only opportunity for social life, but provided aid in time of sickness and death. In this segregated world, especially in cities, a class structure slowly emerged, which was based upon social distinctions such as education and conventional behavior, rather than upon occupation and income. At the top of the social pyramid, there was a small upper class. The superior status of this class was due chiefly to its differentiation from the great mass of the Negro population because of a family heritage which resulted partly from its mixed ancestry. So their mulatto children that they sent to school to be educated became the upper class. A family heritage consisted of traditions of civilized behavior and economic efficiency. The members' light skin color was indicative not only of their white ancestry, but of their descent from the Negroes who were free before the Civil War, or those who had enjoyed the advantages of having served in the houses of their masters. This upper class constantly incorporated those Negroes who were able to acquire an education in the schools supported by Northern philanthropy. The members of the upper class depended on a number of skilled occupations for a living, though there was a sprinkling of teachers, doctors, educated ministers, and small businessmen among them. It was from this isolated social world that thousands of Negroes began migrating to northern industrial centers during the First World War. Although the migrants were attracted to northern cities because of opportunities for employment, the migrants were, in part, a flight from oppression to the promised land of freedom and equality. But many of these Negro migrants became disillusioned about the North when, without neighbors and friends, they faced the keen competition and racial discrimination of the cold, impersonal environment of northern cities. In their disillusionment, many of them joined the Garvey movement, the only serious Negro nationalist movement to arise in the United States. According to the leader of this movement, Marcus Garvey, who was a Negro of West Indian origin, the Negro would never achieve equality in America, a white man's country. And therefore, the only salvation for the Negro was to return to Africa. Negro intellectuals and the middle class Negroes generally were hostile to this movement, which gradually dissolved when the leader was sent to the federal penitentiary in Atlanta. Despite the failure of the Negro to find a promised land in the North, the Negro enjoyed certain advantages in the North that changed his outlook on the world as well as his status in American society. In the North, the Negro worker gained a foothold for the first time in American industry. Negro children had access for the first time on a large scale to a standard American education, generally in non-segregated schools. Negroes enjoyed the right to vote and hold office, and as the result of their political power, could resist racial discrimination. Through their experience with city life, Negroes acquired a certain sophistication towards the world and tended to refine their problems in America. They intended to redefine their problems in America. They did not seek a solution in a narrow program of racial exclusiveness, such as the Garvey movement, especially during the Depression years. Some of them joined the Communist Party, which defined the Negro problem as a problem of national liberation from capitalist oppression. The vast majority of Negroes, however, gave up their sentimental allegiance to the Republican Party and supported the Democratic Party and the New Deal program, which offered concrete economic advantages and a promise of satisfying their aspirations as citizens. Do you hear the first time we left the Republican Party? We started to leave the Republican Party during the New Deal because it offered concrete economic advantages Votes are what you give to someone that's giving you something. The greater economic and social freedom of the North accelerated the slow occupational differentiation of the Negro population. The rise of industrial unions such as the CIO and their more liberal racial policy helped the integration of Negro workers into industry. But workers did not share immediately in the benefits of the economic revival that followed the decision of the United States to become the arsenal of democracy. It was as the result of agitation and the demand for manpower in a war against Nazism with its racial policy that the Negro began to enjoy some of the fruits of an expanding American economy. Since the Second World War, Negroes have continued to receive a larger share of the national income than they did before the war. Moreover, the racial barriers in the North, where nearly 1/3 of the Negroes now live, have tended to be lowered in all phases of public life. In the South, even in the South, the segregation of the Negro has been less rigid in public transportation, and Negro students have been admitted to some public universities. As the result of the changes in the economic status of the Negro middle class, or the Black bourgeoisie, has grown in size and acquired a dominant position among Negroes. I'm going to cut it right there because I usually promise you guys that I'm only going to read for an hour. If you would like to discuss anything that we've read, just let me know. I'm dropping the link. But as you can see, the Black Negro, the Black middle class, the Black bourgeoisie is an interesting group of people because they want to be like white people. They want to get as far away from Black people as possible. And and they have every intention of assimilating and integrating into whiteness. I want to thank you, Brother Bakari, Anthony McPhail, and the Forecast, and you, even you, for listening. I know that Sister Raw is listening with the elders. I know that Bawana Haguziki is listening. I know that KW97 is listening. I know that Denial is listening. I know that, oh my goodness, I know that so many others are listening. I appreciate each and every one of you. The Forecast says E. Franklin Frazier said he was one of them, but he called them out. Yeah, he was one of them, but he calls them out. He calls them out and he talks about some of their problems and some of the challenges with this particular class of Negroes. And, I want you to ask yourself, what responsibility do they have to the rest of the Black world and Black population? Because conspicuous consumption or just buying luxury items is not going to get you equality. It's not going to put you in a better position or better place with white people. They're going to just continue to take your money and continue to deny you your humanity. You just become a cash box or ATM for you. They will create things like $1,000 shoes and $1,500 purses and put you on this cycle of working for wages from somewhere else in an attempt to buy more stuff from them. That's what conspicuous consumption is. It's just buying more stuff, more ostentatious, more gaudy stuff from them in an attempt to prove something. But the stuff that you have is not necessarily a status symbol. The stuff that you have is not a status symbol. The real flex is going back to start a mentoring program in the community that is less, has fewer opportunities than you have. The real flex is going back to start a financial literacy program for people that are as young as 8 or as old as 88 years old. The real flex is doing something and creating something that the entire community can build off of. The real flex is showing people how to hustle and how to take the nothing that they got, rub it together and make something. To show them that even no matter where they are, they have the ability to come together and put together something for themselves. That's the real flex. All right, I will be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I appreciate each and every one of you for being here, and I will see you tomorrow. Peace, guys.